everybody, welcome to the Ramen Bros podcast, where we're your hosts, Bobby and Eric, and we're here to talk about real, authentic male emotions now. And this week, we have a very special guest that I'm super proud to introduce. Eric will introduce rather. Be really excited. I think this is going to have a lot of good content, a lot of core.
Yeah, what's up, guys? So we have Chris Vo today. He's the founder of AMHC, which stands for Asian Mental Health Collective, a nonprofit that helps to destigmatize and normalize mental health in the AAPI community, which is what we're all about here. Also, some other things about him. He is an LMFT therapist based out of Houston, Texas. He's worked in various settings, serving low-income populations, working at juvenile detention facilities, and currently he's got his own private practice. And in his spare time, I quote this from his bio, wrestles with existential dread, imposter syndrome, and enjoys fishing for big game fish. And I've personally known Chris back in the days when I was part of Waves, and we were really growing out a meetup group for Asian Americans in the metro city. So it's good to see you, Chris, and would love to hear obviously all the stories that hopefully we'll share.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here.
Cool. Yeah. And my first impression, I think, is that you're pretty straightforward, and you don't really sugarcoat anything, which I think this is what the podcast is all about, right? We're going to be raw and authentic and pretty vulnerable here. So thanks again for offering your time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to that point, in terms of like how raw I am, or blunt, assertive, I think a lot of people use a lot of different words for that. That's kind of a personality that I have managed to find only in my late 30s. I feel like if you looked at all of the different evolutions, the different phases of my life, whether it be through like middle school, high school, early college, late college, early 30s, late 30s, it took me a while to get here, right? I think at each of those phases, you probably wouldn't recognize me. I should say that.
Yeah, so let me tee us off, actually, and that was a perfect segue. Like, tell us a little bit about your story. Like you mentioned, it took a while for you to get to that ability or the stage to be confident and just straightforward. How did you get there?
Yeah. In terms of like where I started off and what formulated my identity early on was that I was born and raised in Ohio up until I was 17. And if you know anything about Ohio, there's not a whole lot of minorities out there. So probably all up until middle school, I was probably the only Asian that people had ever encountered. A lot of people actually thought I was Mexican because I was the closest to my skin color that they could recognize. And then in middle school, there was a few Asians. In high school, there was a few. And I stood out like a sore thumb. So I was picked on a lot. I dealt with a lot of insecurities. As you can probably relate, back then it also wasn't cool to be Asian. So I was constantly bombarded with all of these negative stereotypes about, what it meant to be Asian and things like that. And I think I kind of felt shame about, who I was during that time period. When I moved down here, my parents moved me down here when I was 17 for my senior year of high school, and they put me in essentially all white preppy, high school for my senior year. And that was also incredibly alienating. I started hanging out with Asians in my early 20s. That's when I started to kind of feel more comfortable with myself and started to embrace my identity. But at that point, I was, too Asian for the white kids and too white for the Asian kids during that point too, right? And I didn't really build confidence and security into myself until my later 20s and into my early 30s and things like that.
And when you were going through this kind of identity, quote unquote, crisis,
Sure.
What was your guiding light? Like, who was helping you, or how were you navigating some of this through conversation?
I think that's a tough question. I think throughout all those different stages, it was, my social support group that was really important. A lot of the different relationships that I cultivated, whether they were romantic or non-romantic.
Hmm.
but I honestly think that the really key deciding factor in all of that was starting to learn to not live towards anyone else's expectations, whether that be my family's, whether that be other social support, like social groups, friends, things like that. And when I started to get more and more comfortable about myself and understood that I was living for myself, it allowed me to show up more authentically. And surprisingly enough, when I started to show up more authentically, people started to naturally gravitate towards me as opposed to me chasing validation from other people, if that makes sense.
Wow. Yeah, no, for sure. I
Mhm.
think the people pleasing aspect is a huge part of, I think, an immigrant experience in some sense. There's a little bit of us as minorities here in the US, and there's a little bit of the model minority myth in terms of where we want to appease people, do the right thing, appear responsible, capable, and trustworthy. A lot of that is good for sure. I'm curious, what was the turning point in terms of like to build the confidence to say, I don't need to please people? And what was your internal monologue? What was the point where you were saying, I'm worth it? How did you find everything you're just worth there?
I think it was when I started to engage with all the different stereotypes and I realized that they weren't true, right?
Mm.
Whether that be from the uh, the dominant culture and the negative stereotypes on Asians, or the stereotypes that were imposed on me from other Asians, right?
Mm.
I don't know how in specific uh, I would want to go into something like that necessarily. But just know that like a lot of the negative stereotypes posed towards Asian men just aren't true, right? But when we engage or are bombarded with all those negative stereotypes about, being less confident, all those things, we start to create like this self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Mm.
And when I started to realize that I was the author of my own story, like that's when things really start to click and change.
That's really powerful, right, Eric? Yeah, that's like be able
Mhm.
to see through the lies and illusions, disillusionment of what your ceiling is, and just realizing you can achieve anything if you put your mind to it. So,
Mhm.
yeah, that's super powerful.
Yeah, you're mentioning this breakthrough that I think a lot of I think just people in general face in their 20s, 30s, right? When they're going through the seasons of life, right? Whether it's in corporate family, relationships, we need to build that, right? And it sounds like you're talking about these like, oh, well, the building block has to be that it comes from yourself. Like you have to challenge those stigmas and stereotypes, and then you realize you stand on top of that, which is, I think that's what I'm hearing is super powerful.
Mhm.
Um, when you mentioned that you were too light for Asian people and too Asian for white people, where did you fall? Like, so can you share a little bit about like how you navigated some of that too?
Yeah, like it's funny because like when I reflect on it, like I still don't necessarily fully understand what it means to be like gatekeeping Asianness, right? I feel like the
Mm.
next generation now has much less of that and they're able to recognize that. But I feel like, for example, down here, a lot of the Asians lived in an area, the Chinatown around here, Bel
Mhm.
Air, Southwest Ailey, Texas, nicknamed SWAT, right? And it is very adjacent or a part of the hood, right? So because of the fact that I didn't live or grow up in that shared experience necessarily, um, kind of alienated me from that, right? But that also dismissed a lot of the struggles, trials, and tribulations that I also had to live through, because of my Asianness, I would say, within the white culture, right? It wasn't that I didn't fight, I had to fight all the time because I was the only minority in the school, right? I just had to fight for different reasons than the Asians over here on this side had to.
When you say fight, just so that people who are listening understand this, you're talking about actually physically fighting, like you're actually
I
getting
mean,
there and
actually physically.
brawling.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think I grew up being like the runt of the class through middle school and probably early high school too. I was literally one of the smallest kids in the class, right? And then when I hit puberty and I, grew to 5'9.5", 5'10", whatever I am right now, I started to realize that I could defend myself during that time. And then especially when I moved down here to Houston, Texas, and was placed into the high school that I was placed into, Friendswood High School, people challenged me, and I went into it with literally a jailhouse mentality. I said, if I let this slide now, it's going to continue to happen, right? And I recall one moment where someone literally walked past me in the hallway and said, "Hey, what's up, Chink? Can I get some fried rice?" And I thought about it for like 3 seconds, and I was like, I can't allow this to happen. And I grabbed him by his throat and I threw him into a locker, and I just did what I had to do at that point, right? And in the first 3 weeks of school, I think I got into 6 or 7 fights from it.
Dude, that is, I think I just reacted to it very raw. I'm obviously very triggered by that. I think it's just a huge sign of disrespect when that happens, right?
Yeah.
I think for us as men too, there's something along the lines of pride and ego, and that's also associated with worth and value. When somebody says something like that, that's not only disrespectful, it's devaluing you as a human being in some sense, right?
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious too, from all of this, how did intersperse throughout? I'm kind of curious, how did your mental health journey start? So how did you, were you exposed ever to therapy? Was there stigma around that, perceptions around that? And but for the people that are listening out there, what was some of the did you believe, like, how do you feel about talking through your problems and the confidence in that to be able to help resolve issues?
Well, I think a lot of our identity is formulated of one of two ways. You either take in what your environment is showing you, and by environment, I mean your relationships. They could be with family, parents, social, etc. And you absorb that and take on those attributes. Or you can go the opposite route of you can observe what's going on around you and reject it and go the opposite route. That's the path that I chose, right? So with my family, we had the typical Asian family where we didn't really discuss our problems, even though you could see the cracks in the foundation, right? And it was very lonely, right? And I remember feeling a lot of, angst, teen angst during that period, which also probably fueled my fights during that time period. It was an outlet for that too, right? And I remember wanting to be a therapist as soon as I was introduced to the concept of psychology when I was like 15, 16, because I wanted to heal that intergenerational trauma for other families, right? So they didn't have to go through the same things that I went through.
That's a big word, and then thanks for sharing that. Obviously that's huge. The word intergenerational trauma, I jokingly call it IG trauma, in which there is Instagram trauma too. I'm kind of curious, Leah, so how would you define intergenerational trauma? I think that means a lot of different things, a lot of different people, but how would you narrow that scope a little bit?
Sure. I mean, it's the trickle down effect that comes from, generation to generation, right? I think every generation feels like they do the best with what they have, right? And they try to reduce the amount of trauma to the next generation, but they still impose some of that, right? And that could be anything from, for example, corporal punishment, right? A common statement that I'll hear when parents that engage in corporal punishment is, I'm not hitting you anywhere near as bad as, my parents did, or you don't know what getting hit really feels like, and those different types of things. But you're still imposing harm and hurt on someone that you love in those moments, right? But because it's less than, they can't really understand that. And then that generational trauma gets passed down to the person below them, right? And hopefully that person below them takes that opportunity to reduce the amount of trauma that gets imposed on. That's not always what happens, right? Sometimes it ends up coming out twofold to the generation after them. And then you could end up, in this vicious cycle.
Like back in my days, and then go on and on. And yeah, you drop some really like good bombs there, right? Like I think the intergenerational problems that we face as immigrant children, there's probably a lot that comes where there's that societal pressure to date and find a nice spouse, to get into the best schools and college, and then get the best job, and then make the most money and buy that house, etc. I'm curious about when we experience that and we see that from our parents, how do we usually how should we kind of approach that as our parents are also going through their own traumas and their own triggers. What can you share a little bit about that?
To clarify, do you mean like how you should engage with your parents' expectations of you in terms of like finances, appearance, stigmas, things like that?
Yeah, because the one side of the intergenerational trauma is that it's a trickle down, but the other side I feel like is the when they go through their own traumas and they push it onto us as children. And
Mm.
so
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really delicate balance that you have to play, right? On some hand, there is legitimacy in the things that they want and they desire, especially from the environment that they came from, right? My parents they probably would be considered wealthy in Vietnam when they lived in Vietnam. But both of my parents independently had everything taken from them, from the war, right? The North took everything from them and distributed amongst themselves, and they were forced to immigrate over here. So to come from that level of financial insecurity, right? I can absolutely understand moving here with not knowing the language and being able to create successful families, households, financial security for themselves is an amazing thing. And of course, they would want that for myself, for example, right? The problem is that they don't necessarily engage with who I am as a person, right? And even I'll say that even after everything that I've done at this point, right? I have my master's, I make decent money. I do investments. I started a nationally recognized nonprofit. I still don't get recognized or respect from that, right? And it hurts because all you really want as a child is to be seen and understood, right? And there's a piece of me that mourns my parents while they're still alive. And that's a really weird thing to say out loud. I don't think I fully answered your question, but I think I talked about it in a roundabout way, if that makes sense.
thanks for sharing that, man.
Yeah, let me jump in here for a quick second.
Hmm.
So even long, Eric, your question too, two words come to mind. So it's boundaries and then context, right? I think similar to you. So my parents have a really similar history. The Chinese version of that is growing up in the Cultural Revolution, in which they had a lot of their family's wealth stripped and taken away and then sent to the farmlands and having to have this Game of Thrones Targaryen reclaiming the throne sort of
Mm.
mission when we came to the States.
Yeah.
So I think financial stability and survivalism is to a fair point a key goal for us to have, right? And then I think in the Chinese culture, I think there is a strong idolization of money and whatnot. But again, to your point, it's well intentioned, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's a little bit of the context in terms of how their decision making and their framework makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
However, to your point of like, for boundaries for us as to be treated as human beings, I think there's a little bit of agency delicately in which, it's a little bit tricky in which we can kind of defend to Eric's point against what our parents are imposing onto us.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm guessing how do you just even look at that? How do you even look at the whole different web of everything that's happening? And
Yeah,
I guess, have you been able to kind of navigate
Hmm.
um,
sure.
all that?
I mean, what I've always said whenever you're engaging with these complex issues like this is one, you need to learn how to craft a message to the receiver. And I think the roundabout point that I was trying to get to was that empathy. You have to empathize and fully understand the person across the aisle exactly what the totality of their entire experiences, right?
Hmm.
And if you don't understand that and you're just crafting an argument, you're speaking to no one, right?
Mm.
So if you can frame the context of what you're trying to present to them from their lens in a language that they can understand, that will get you leagues further, right? Understanding that empathy is not necessarily a condemnation of actions, right? You can empathize with someone and understand where they came from, but still say, hey, that still hurt me, or that still disrespect my boundaries and things like that. But you've got to validate their position first so that they can be on your side. If not, they're going to continuously be defensive. And I feel like all of us have been in those conversations
Hmm.
lightly putting it, with our parents where they're just so deeply entrenched and not listening, right? That's me going like full therapeutic on you. After you fully able to validate and express their position, and then you can clarify and ask them if you've gotten everything right. Only then can you really launch in and give your perspective on the matter, right? And again, you've got to use language that they understand. If you're using psychological language with your parents, it's not going to work, right? These are concepts they've never really engaged in. A lot of our mother tongues don't even have words for the concepts that I need to utilize in therapy, right? So that's where I would start from there.
The funny commentary is that I also learned that like in Chinese, the word for therapy, even boundaries as a word in Chinese didn't exist for a while, and then therapy itself was borrowed from the Taiwanese language. So
Yeah,
it's just really funny that you're exactly right.
yeah,
And I love what you just said about allyship. It's all about this is kind of what I do at work as well. It's a little bit of persuasion, but it's kind of building a united front with them and trying to remember we're on the same team, even though we're fighting against each other for different things.
mm,
It's a mutual respect to each other, but eventually you're trying to win them over by you're really empathizing with them truly. So I'd love to
sure.
hear that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I like I said, it's just fully understanding their experience. But I also, on the flip side, recognize that that comes with capacity too, right? I want to make clear because I always run into the situation when I'm explaining this issue that sometimes you're not going to have the capacity in order to achieve that allyship, that empathy. And sometimes the correct boundary is actually to just remove yourself from the situation, whether that be temporarily or permanently. I think that's something that you have to decide when heads are cooler. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. I personally will affirm that too, in the sense that like being there might be just do more damage, and then some people just can't learn some of the things you want them to do. That's something I'm working through with my parents right now, and a lot of us just having a healthy distance and acceptance of the situation. So yeah, for sure,
Yeah,
for
yeah,
sure.
And this is a very special platform because I think a lot of people who are listening are maybe curious about therapy. They've never tried talk therapy before, counseling in general. So, how would you describe therapy as an Asian male, and what does that actually look like? Just like talk to us like a 5-year-old. Like, what is it? Can you just walk us through it?
Sure. I think the biggest thing that we talk about is like processing in therapy. That's the goal, is to process
Mm,
whatever, right? But that term gets used a lot and people don't really fully understand it. And the way that I describe it is that you're taking the past, right? Reflecting on that, how it's affected you in the past, and then taking that and connecting it to the present, right? How has those past decisions, events, traumas, whatever, affect your decision making, feeling, emotions in the now, right? And then I look at it in like layers, right? It's how can you constantly go deeper with your decision making and where it comes from, right? And I'll give you an example, right? And that is, a few weeks ago, someone commented on my hustler mentality, right? And they asked me, well, where did that come from? And the first sentence that came to my mind was, well, you just have to, right? Well, why did I have to, right? And then it came back down into, well, in college, in my master's program, I was bartending until 6:30 in the morning and then going to class at 8:30, right? And sometimes I literally had no idea if I had slept. But then where did that come from even further, right? Well, in high school, in order to gain social status, I had to hustle, right? In terms of providing, services for different
mm,
people and things like that, or trying to figure out and had to work hard in order to break into social groups, right? But where did that come from? And then it clicked in my head, and I was like, oh, yeah, I remember when my parents used to work 80 hours a week. And I don't fault them for this, I want to make that clear. But they were both working 80 hours a week. There were times where I didn't see them. You know, there was a period of my life for 2 years where the only time I saw my father was when my mom would take me to his office to see him during lunch because he was literally working 7 days a week, right?
mm,
Or a year and a half, 2 years straight, 7 days a week, which is
mm,
insane. Now that we think about it now, right? And because of that, sometimes I was forgotten during that time period, right? Sometimes my parents would forget to sign permission slips or, send me to school without lunch money. So what did I have to do? I had to hustle during that time period, right? And I figured out different ways to make money so that I could eat for lunch. And then that's where that's probably developed from. And that's why it's so important to me now. And now I have to engage with the fact that, well, now I'm 38. Is that same mentality useful? Because that saved me and was very functional then, but is it dysfunctional now? Right. And then I have to make that decision when I reflect on it. In terms of like, what does therapy look like? I think that really depends on the therapist, right? I think there's all different types of therapists. There are type A therapists who have like very set protocols. This is what it looks like week 1, week 2, week 3, almost like a lesson plan or the way that a professor would teach it, right? So there are some clinicians who are very clinical, right? Where they treat it similar to the scientific method, right? Well, let's observe this behavior. How many times does it occur? Well, here's a different behavior that we can replace it with. How many times is it occurring now? Some therapists are what I call a blank slate therapist. That's what you typically see in media depictions of therapy. That is if you ask them a question, they bounce it back to you. You don't know what they're thinking. It is, well, tell me, how does that make you feel? Right?
Classic.
My I am not a huge fan of that therapy, but all of these different therapies work for different styles of people, right? For me, uh, it is exactly how I'm communicating to you right now. I try to keep it conversational. I like to make it feel as safe and as vulnerable, almost as if you're talking to a friend, but obviously with boundaries and also much more pointed in terms of the direction of the conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I love that. I mean, it sounds like therapy at first, it can, if I put this in video game terms, it's almost like you took a lot of damage from your childhood and you're trying to use therapy to assess the impact of the damage to your abilities and how you're able to fight in the current stage. And you're trying to do deep healing to kind of restore your character to full strength and grow and get even stronger.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's not just healing, it's about building resistances, right? If you're going to use video game terminology, that way you can encounter future situations and not take as much damage from them.
Right. And a new different strategy of how to cope with or handle different futures, monsters, situations, and all that, right? And I think I loved also how you juxtapose therapy in terms of like, it's almost like talking to a friend, but with boundaries. But I also think obviously with professional training, a deeper set of skills to help like unpack some of the harder things, right? I think even in my journey, I remember when I go with my first mental health crisis, a panic attack, I was talking to my friends. And for me, it was like in the Christian circle. So a lot of it's like, just pray about it. Everything happens for a good reason. So just have faith. I mean, some of that is definitely true, but obviously wasn't what I needed in the moment. And the most helpful thing for me was being able to have space to kind of just a non-judgmental space, period. I think a lot of it gets easily categorized into good or bad. So I'm kind of curious to how do you look at the different benefits of what therapy can do versus just what friends can do for you? What was that deeper level of healing look like a little more tangibly?
Well, like you said, it's obviously a higher level of training, a deeper level of understanding when it comes to these things. It is the fact that the professional in front of you has probably seen dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of very similar patterns show up, right? So they know the steps that you can take to help break those patterns. It is a lot of psychoeducation, right? For example, with like panic attacks, I often relate it to the biological model. What does panic look like? What does anxiety look like? What does excitement look like? They all look the same within the body, and things like that. How to calm down and de-escalate. And I would also say there's just something different about having an objective third party in front of you, right? I obviously want you to heal, right? But I can tell it from a perspective that is not necessarily emotionally involved in the situation.
I can imagine with friends too. It definitely borders on the line of advice. In my story, and Eric, I'm sure you can relate to. It's like we've gotten a lot of different advice. Just solve your work problem, and that'd be it. And then with that too, like your friends want something out of you. They want you to feel better so they can get back to like a healthy. I mean, just like to go hang out with them at times per se.
Mhm.
But yeah, I'm kind of curious, Eric. What do you? Yeah, how did you look at the pros and cons of therapy from your own personal experience relating to this?
Say it one more time.
Yeah,
Oh, Eric, just feel free to
Are you
share
talking to
thoughts.
Eric?
Yeah, Eric, just kind of I want to hear Eric's commentary because I think we both relate to this a lot. Kind of, so
Yeah.
this is like, so we're definitely like the patient side. Like we, I think we're trying to model what it looks like to have gone through therapy as well. So.
yeah. I'll make a quick comment. And I think it's almost like dating, where you can meet a therapist and you just connect right away. You're like able to just share openly and like you just connect. And sometimes I've had experiences where like I can't talk to this person. They don't understand what I'm going through, which different generations, speaking styles. So I think it maybe is also like a dynamic between the therapist and the patient, or the person that's speaking. But I wanted to get a little more personal and maybe pivot to, as you're a therapist speaking with, just let's talk about Asian men. When are you most frustrated, or like what are some of the biggest challenges for you personally as a therapist?
My frustrations with the state of Asian men. So I'm going to break this down into three possibilities, right? My
Mhm.
frustration with the state of Asian men as like a context,
Mm,
what Asian men typically struggle with in the context of therapy,
mm.
or my place in therapy as an Asian man.
Love it. Yeah, all three. Let's go.
Um, I think my biggest frustration with what it means to be an Asian man, stop there, is especially observing nowadays, is how it is incredibly frustrating to see how much the stereotypes have affected who we become, right? I constantly see the self-deprecating humor. I constantly see the lack of confidence. Um, I just constantly see the self-doubt, right? And I see it changing a little bit, but I still see those constant themes, right? And that just makes me sad, right? And a lot of it is probably because of the journey that I went through in order to be more confident in myself and be more assertive and things like that. But I honestly see it so often, and obviously in all of these large groups that we help moderate, right? Um, in terms of what Asian men typically deal with in terms of therapy, I'll say even Asians in general, but yes, especially Asian men. I think Asian men have that duality, right? Asians in general have these stigmas of honor and saving face, preventing them from going to therapy, right? To be vulnerable is to be weak, right? To share any insight is to be shameful, right? And then when you move towards the masculine side of things, men are only allowed to show two different emotions, and that is anger and happiness. Those are the only two acceptable emotions for men to experience, right?
Mhm.
Anything else is met with rejection, right? And when you ask, and this is in masculine terms, if you ask a man if they're okay, the way that we are asking it is if we are in a firefight, right? And that is like if you imagine we're in war and I asked you, Eric, hey man, are you okay? And you answered me, uh, I guess my mom hasn't called me in like a month. I don't know what that's about, right? If we were in war, it would be shut the fuck up. What are you doing? Look forward and cover my six, right? That's the only way we think about it. When we ask, are you okay? It isn't about the nuances of your emotions and how you're feeling. It is, are you okay to continue with your designated duties? Or are you not? Because then I have to find a replacement. Does that make sense? That's how I feel masculine culture looks at whether it's okay to be okay or not. And in the context of being an Asian male therapist, I'm pretty much a unicorn in this. Like, obviously, there are other Asian male therapists, but in like different pockets and areas and things like that, uh, being a male therapist is a massive rarity. Being a minority male therapist is an extra layer of that, right?
Mm.
And sometimes it can be frustrating in certain ways. Like I'm absolutely blessed and happy with the fact that people come to me and seek refuge and help. but in other avenues, it can be daunting. And when I talked about like imposter syndrome, to that sometimes people look at me as like the voice of my entire culture, right? And that's not what I want to be. I only want to speak for
Mm.
Chris and my lived experience, and I want to be able to maybe give insight into what it means to be Asian or a male, etc. But I don't want to speak for all of us.
I have some follow-up questions. So this is great. I love how you're able to think that the whole "are you okay" thing is mind-blowing to me. I think I'm realizing it's almost as we talk to each other as we have binary emotions, like good or bad, and that's it. But the reality is we have a whole kaleidoscope of different sort of complex emotions underneath. And I think for men, we talk a lot about emotional vocabulary, but developing words to describe these feelings. I'm curious for you, how have you developed, male toolkits to be able to express this? So words is one way, but there's definitely other ways as well. I'm aware. So how do you approach that?
Sure. I mean, the emotion wheel is what I start with, right? And I don't know if you guys have encountered that, but it has like the primary emotions on the inside, then it has a secondary level of emotions, and then a third level of emotions, right? And the easiest way that I can describe it is I used to work in juvenile detention, right? And I was a therapist in juvenile detention, and I used to work in the gang violence and sexual trauma, which obviously was very heavy stuff. And the kids would fight all the time. It was constant, day in, day out. They would threaten to fight me day in and day out, right? I reached a lot of them, don't get me wrong, but when at first I think it was difficult to encounter them with their anger. But then when I started to realize that the anger was their primary emotion, that was what they were displaying, that was what they were acting upon, but anger wasn't what they were actually feeling. You can't be angry in a vacuum, right? What they were actually feeling was a reaction to something else. And the reaction that they were feeling was they could be feeling scared that they were in a new environment by themselves, right? They could be feeling sad, abandoned, and lonely because of the fact that their parents didn't show up when they graduated from their GED, right? They could be feeling anxious about whether or not they would be getting sent home soon, right? So when you can dig deeper into what the anger is trying to tell you, the anger is protecting you, but what the anger is actually
Mm.
trying to tell you that you're feeling, that's when you dig deeper. And then you dig deeper into that. Well, what is that emotion actually trying to tell you? And what insecurity does that stem from? And that's what it means to be processing, right? The deeper, complex layer of emotions.
Man, that's so good. It's so good. I think we just gotta like appreciate that emotional wheel analogy or that framework, because I think that's gonna help so many people just to start thinking about what you just said.
Mm,
Like anger is not the primary emotion.
mm,
It's it's something that you're reacting to. That I think that's powerful. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I think I was going to say that, like, I think anger is a very stigmatized emotion in which it's obviously negative, but I think in the mental health world, I've heard anger being reframed as a good emotion in the sense that we know a boundary is crossed, but in this case, something else is being triggered, like an unmet expectation or a sense of injustice,
Mhm.
and it kind of prods us, encourages us to kind of dig deeper into the whole, like, what are my beliefs and systems around these expectations, and that can lead to a lot of like reparenting, which is what also therapy is in some sense, right? It's like if you could treat yourself as a child with the perfect set of parents, how would you manage that situation in that in that context? So yeah, Eric, did you want to keep digging deeper, or let's do a quick time check, by the way.
Yeah, I think we can do the AMA section because I definitely have some pressing questions that if you're cool with it, Chris, we can
Sure.
try to just dig a little bit deeper. Um, I want to start off. We talked a lot about masculinity, boundaries, as Asian men. How does social media, in your perspective right now, talking with a bunch of these people, right? Hundreds of clients now, how is that kind of shaping Asian men as you see it?
Mm, mm. I try to engage with these types of questions as objectively as possible, right? Um, because are you familiar with Bo Burnham, the comic?
Bob,
So
who?
he's a comedian,
Oh,
right?
okay, okay, yeah, yeah.
And he talks about like the difference in the way that boomers think versus like the newer generation. And one of his bits, he talks about like boomers always talking about like, why are kids always on their phones? And his response is, yeah, why would anyone want to have all of the information of the entire world at their fingertips all the time? And I was like, oh yeah, I guess that kind of makes sense, right? So the way that I look at it is there's pros and cons to the way social media has shaped how anyone interacts with mental health, right? I think that in aspects, there are absolutely damaging aspects to it in terms of like the constant dopamine hits that you're getting, right? I think there are, unrealistic expectations that are constantly pushed in front of everyone, and that can absolutely, alter the way that you think, the way that you behave, the way that you interact with the world, and prevent you from being present in the world. On the flip side, I also see how it has opened up so many doors for people that don't have that may have not had the opportunity to communicate, connect, and be vulnerable. It's opened up so many doors for people to share their vulnerability and start topics, start conversations about topics that I never would have dreamed of having access to as a teen, right? So, yeah, I mean, that's what I would say. There's definitely massive pros, but there's also massive cons attached to it too. And it's just how you choose to interact and adapt to the technology is important.
Yeah, I like
Yeah.
that. Oh, I was gonna say that there's always pros and cons, and I love how that you're so methodical in terms of these, because that was a loaded question, right? So
Yeah.
I love that there's always the pros and cons, and it comes down to choice and what we decide to do with what's presented to us in society. We can't just ban social media or just get off the grid completely. It's practically impossible. Um,
Mhm.
so I think that maybe also is something that we navigate through counseling or therapy. Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, and especially coming from a place having worked at Meta or a social media company, I think it's funny how like, we're all aware and of what the sins of social media has done, and there's a little bit of repentance and there's a little bit of ownership as well. And I personally have fallen victim to the comparison traps through social media news feeds of what my life should look like, even what my body image should look like to be successful. Um, but I do think there is a different sort of content out there, right? I think what we're trying to do, we're trying to create content showing you sometimes the worst parts of the more vulnerable, real parts of life as well to balance it out. So the exposure there as well. And yeah, I don't think social media has to be necessarily a negative experience for people. There's definitely a lot more controls. There's a lot more times when your news feeds like stops when you've seen everything. So I think in that space, it's definitely a matured space where it's aware of the pros and cons.
Okay, another question. What's your dating advice for people in their, let's say, late 20s, throughout their 30s, trying to navigate life? I think this is a really hot topic for a lot of listeners. And I'm curious to hear kind of your thoughts as you talk to people who are maybe looking for relationships or who've gotten out of relationships. How do you really navigate that conversation? Because I know it's quite delicate.
Yeah, this is such a long form conversation in of itself. Uh, Couples therapy is probably one of my bread and butter, right?
Mm,
Therapies. Um, and one thing that I try to explain to people is that it's very hard to date for your forever person if you don't truly know yourself right now, right? And if you don't know who you are right now, what you're doing is just trying to jam two puzzle pieces together in the here and now, and then hoping that the two of you continue on the same path for the decades afterwards, right? But that's not actually being mindful of, the person in front of you and their complexity of their entire experience. So my first advice is take a lot of time to just reflect and figure out who you are, right? And you don't have to have that answer right away, right? I mentioned before that in each of these different phases of my life, I've been a completely different person, right? And sometimes the relationships that you cultivate during that period of your life is the perfect relationship for you during that period of your life, right? And when you evolve, I think what's most important if you, have to exit a relationship is to reflect on what you can learn and what you can take away from that relationship. If you look at it as, necessary and beautiful for that period of your life. I think the as you get older, you kind of let go of the highlight reel of dating. When people are insecure about themselves, the first 1 to 6 to 10 dates are you just trying to win the other person over and show the highlight reel to posture yourself as like the perfect match for this person. And as you get older, you just show who you are, and that person can learn to take it or not, right? Because you found that security in yourself, and you're able to deal with that rejection much easier. Personally, and I was able to deal with that rejection much easier because as when I became more comfortable and assertive with myself, I recognized, hey, we just didn't work out because we didn't work out, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I don't have to internalize that as a rejection of me, right? That just means that we didn't work out, and that's okay, right? Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, those are my main points that I would say in terms of dating.
Yeah, can you dig a little bit briefly into a little bit of what you just said earlier about knowing yourself? I think that's a common phrase we get a lot of the times, right? So I've navigated through just the idea of understanding your core values and making decisions based on that. So is there any sort of framework or just any other thought starters for listeners to be able to like navigate the self-discovery process?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know a real perfect answer for that, honestly. Like, I wish I could answer that in a nice, tight little bow, right? But I feel like you learn just as much from failing at something or learning that you don't like something, right? From that experience, as much as you do when you find something that you really like. Does that make sense? So sometimes through these failures, there are massive lessons that you can introspect about yourself. Um, and like if you're looking at like a hyperbolic example of that, it's high school, right? What did everyone do in high school? One year a kid shows up as a jock, one year they show up as a goth, one year they show up as this, one year they show up as that. It's because they're trying to adapt and find their identity. They just don't know how. They just gravitate to someone else, right? And I feel like to some extent we're still doing that in our 20s, right? We just feel like we're not doing that to some extent, right? But yeah, as you get older, you just don't be afraid to challenge yourself and your boundaries and your expectations, and kind of let go, especially of like the timeline and what like the perfect relationship looks like. It should honestly just look whatever is authentic to you, right? I've done couples therapy for a very long time now, and I've seen so many dynamics that have worked and so many dynamics that haven't worked. I've seen couples that I could have sworn were going to make it through, not, and I've seen couples that in my head was very reluctant to think that they would make it through, but they absolutely did. I've worked with anything from polyamory to open marriages to marriages where people literally lived in different homes in the same neighborhood, which was to me a very unique concept. But it's what worked for them, and that's what made the two of them happy. That is awesome, right?
Wow. It sounds like you really need to know what you want, and that person has to be on board and understand that this is what you want and these are your boundaries. And if they accept that, then you put the effort in. But before you do any of that and you establish that baseline, you're also all setting up yourself for failure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just as important to know what you don't want in a relationship, right? I think we gravitate towards certain people at the beginning for like superficial reasons. And I don't mean just looks when I say superficial. I mean like hobbies and like shared interests and things like that too, right? But what makes that person unique, right? I ran into a quote that made me process love a little bit differently. And I don't recall the exact words, but it said that love is not, having sex with someone. It's not living with someone. It's not the chores that you do with someone. Love is the unique language that you create with someone else. And when you lose that love, it is you mourning the fact that you can never speak that language with anyone else ever again. Right. And I thought that was so beautiful because it's true, right? If you move on from one relationship into a next flourishing relationship, you can do all the exact same activities, but the way that it shows up, the way that you communicate, the language of that relationship would be completely unique, right? And the second piece of that is oftentimes like everyone gets along when they get along, right? That's why we talk about the honeymoon period. It's much more important as a couples therapist how you disagree, right?
Mm.
How you heal, how you solve a relationship, how you repair, and how you communicate your boundaries and expectations, right? Do you validate each other's positions? Do you both walk away from a conflict feeling like the both of you have been heard, right? When we talk about conflict, I feel like it exists on two different spectrums. And one is a discussion and one is a debate, right? A discussion is two people trying to fully understand each other's position. I've talked about that before. And the other piece is a debate where two people are trying to impose their will upon the other, right? And that's the side of the spectrum that a lot of us will get locked into, but is the unhealthiest thing that you can do in a relationship, right? Because the best case scenario that occurs in that is that one person is a loser and one person is a winner, and that is not a happy household.
These are so good. I'm just soaking and just chewing on it right now. One last question from me and Bobby. Uh, what do therapists do? Therapists need therapists, right? You kind of talked about imposter syndrome, but can you walk us through what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, Therapists absolutely need therapists. We take on so much trauma. We hear so much of the dark side of the world that sometimes it can be challenging to remember the good, right? That's especially how I felt when I was working juvenile detention, right? I was met with a lot of bleakness in terms of, you know, the system, about the things that I heard and all of those things. And recidivism, was really hard to witness. But yeah, especially the way that the system works against all of those kids really hurt me. But yeah, we need an objective place where we can vent. It's not fair for us to do that to our partners, right? It's not fair for us to do that to our friends. That's not respectful of their boundaries. It's not respectful of their capacity, right? And you also just need that objective third party sometimes to hear you out and validate what it is that you're hearing, feeling, seeing, and give you, their thoughts on the matter. Um, as a therapist that has a therapist, it is very challenging sometimes, especially I feel like in the spotlight I am because of the nonprofit and things like that. I am always constantly paranoid about things I disclose making a way back to a future coworker or someone else that'll see me at like a panel or something like that. So I have to vet my therapist very thoroughly before I can. And I know that that's, a difficulty that a lot of other therapists probably face too, of that fear, right? But like you said, it's the bond that you feel between the therapist when you initially meet them. That's really important.
Sweet. Uh, let's end with this. 3 things you would tell your younger self if you can share everything that you've had, experience, knowledge wise. I think it'd be a nice way to land.
Mm. I think the first thing I would say is that you are enough. A lot of my childhood, I felt like I wasn't enough for whatever reason, right? And a lot of it was from my ADHD, right? Not fully understanding that, or feeling like I didn't fit in with, these different cultures. And again, when I found that out and healed that piece of myself as an adult, that's when life started to fall into place. The second piece that I would say is you don't have to go on anyone else's timeline, right? You know, that cultural pressure that you feel, or even societal pressure that you feel to hit these different marks at these very specific times, let go of that. Life is a beautiful journey, right? It's not an endpoint, because the endpoint is not being here anymore, right? So focus on enjoying being present and enjoying, you know, every piece of that. And the third piece is buy Bitcoin early as possible.
Yeah, there we go. To the moon.
That's where I'm at, baby.
I
Wow.
freaking love it. And I also love the human aspect of therapy that inserting humor is just like the best way to make light of life. And I freaking love that. Sorry, Bobby, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I think a lot of this resonates with me on a very soulful level, but yes, definitely comedically too, as finances are also a huge part of our mental health. But
Mhm.
I think my closing remarks, yeah, I think Chris, I think when we first met, I didn't really know what to expect from our first conversation, but I think I was very impressed and wowed just by the sheer strategic vision I think you had for one, not only the mental health space, but also like for our organization, Asian Mental Health Collective. But I think here too, I think I'm also impressed by the depth of the topics and I think the way you conduct therapists. So the conduct therapy, and yeah, I was really I think a lot of what you said kind of resonates with a lot of my core values, and yeah, I love the message that you're preaching, and obviously we are here to amplify that.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I definitely want to say that, you know, I appreciate all of the work that the both of you have done and how you've shaped not only the organization and all of that, but just getting to know the both of you personally. Right. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. So I think that's a good place to conclude this. Thanks, Chris, again, for dropping some real great knowledge. I think this will help a lot of people. And man, we should have started on that dating first because there's so much meat there, but we'll save for another time.
Sure.
All right. Thanks again, guys, and we'll talk to you next time. Peace.
See you guys. Bye.